We took a view, which is not necessarily a very popular view, that if you're in an alliance with another country, that country will come to your help if you run into difficulties. And if they run into difficulty and they need your help, you go to help them.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. What did Percy Spender, Richard Casey, Garfield Barwick and Paul Hasluck all have in common? Well, they were ministers for external affairs during the second Menzies prime ministership. Now, Richard Casey held that role for almost 9 years, and this was at the height of the Cold War. It was during the Suez Crisis and the Vietnam War. The ANZUS Treaty was signed by Casey on the 1st of September 1951, defining Australia's strategic posture for the last 74 years. But in December 2004, Casey's record as Australia's longest-serving Foreign Minister was exceeded by Howard Government Foreign Minister Alexander Downer. Now, like Casey, Downer served as Foreign Minister during an incredibly consequential era for Australian foreign policy. That post-Cold War era brought with it the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Bali bombings, the rise of an assertive China, fragmentation of Western democracies and Russian aggression in Europe. There were wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the independence of East Timor, and bringing about of peace to the Solomon Islands. Now, an examination of the legacies of long-serving foreign ministers like Casey and Downer, and on the Labor side, Doc Evatt and Gareth Evans, shows just how important these politicians are in framing what is in our national interest and how we want Australia to be viewed by the world. So today, joining me to discuss the life and times of Australia's longest-serving foreign minister are Tony Parkinson and Alexander Downer himself. Now, Tony is a journalist, advisor and political insider whose career has taken him from reporting on wars and elections across Europe and the Middle East to working at the centre of the Australian government. He has a new biography out about Alexander Downer, A Step to the Right, The Life and Times of Alexander Downer, which we'll be talking about today. And of course, in addition to being Australia's longest-serving Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer was the youngest ever leader of the Federal Liberal Party at just 42, and he has the great honour of being my father. Tony, Alexander, welcome to Afternoon Light.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Tony, I'm going to start with you, biographer's prerogative here. What was the impetus behind this biography? I mean, Dad, Alexander's been out of politics since 2008. It's been a while. Was there something that you felt needed to be said particularly today?
Yeah, I think there had been some very significant achievements by the Howard government in the foreign policy sphere. You mentioned some of them in your introduction. And it seemed to me that there was certainly a gap in the market. Alexander had not written his memoirs himself, and he hasn't since he left office. So Josh Friedberg and I were discussing the issue. We both thought it was a shame if the story was left untold. And so I took on the project.
And why no memoirs, Alexander?
It's a very simple reason that I couldn't really bring myself to sit down and think about and write about myself for months on end. I think it would have just driven me mad. I don't think it's very healthy to be thinking about yourself the whole time. And if you're writing an autobiography, you might gloss over some of your mistakes and some of the periods that went badly wrong, or you might try and find someone else to blame, which is the normal game that people play, rather than accept full responsibility yourself. I find it easier to accept the responsibility for the mistakes I made myself via a biography rather than having to write it myself.
Yeah. Do you think there are some memoirs that have been done well, Tony, autobiographical memoirs? I mean, we obviously, Robert Menzies has Afternoon Light and A Measure of the Years that were criticised actually for being too memoirish and less sort of autobiographical. I think people wanted more of the sort of step-by-step account of how he came to be who he was and the reasoning behind key decisions, but it was sort of really reflections on certain people and events.
Yeah, well, there's Menzies. Most Prime Ministers usually write their memoirs in Australia. That's John Howard certainly has. Bob Hawke did. Gough Whitlam has had maybe 25 books by or about him.
Yes, 32 actually.
32,
yes,
okay.
we calculated that the other day.
Oh, there's a bit of a kick up in the last
it's
few
Pro
weeks, wasn't it?
Branson's just added the 30-second. Yeah.
So I think there was a very famous one written by a British cabinet minister in the 1960s. Trying to think, Anthony Crossman, yeah.
The Crossman Diaries.
Which were regarded as very, very brutally honest and upfront. Alexander's being a bit modest about his approach to this book. When I spoke to him, at one time he even said to me, "You must talk to people who don't like me. They won't be very hard to find."
No.
Georgina could give you a list.
He's been very happy to take any questions I've asked and answer them honestly and forthrightly, and that's been very important and helpful.
Something about Dad that I guess sets him apart from a lot of politicians, not all politicians, but a lot of Australian politicians, is that he grew up in a political family, and likewise I grew up in a political family, and your father grew up in a political family. What was it like discovering those formative years and I guess trying to sort of tell that side of the story that has, I guess, been publicised through Alexander's political career through the jibes from Paul Keating, the idiot son of the establishment and the like, and that there's a lot of stereotyping about his upbringing.
Sure.
But when you dug into it, what did you discover?
I found it fascinating. I spent a lot of time in those archives at the University of South Australia.
Oh, yes, in Mawson Lakes. Yes.
Yeah, in particular, reading Lady Mary Downer's, Alexander's mum's oral history, which was very revealing about all sorts of things about their life in wartime and also beyond. So, I found really insightful your podcasts. I mean, you've done several with your dad. And I think it's unusual when a child interviews or a daughter or son interviews their parent. You tend to find the conversation rolls along really well, and it's very candid and very direct, a bit like having a chat around the kitchen table, but on record. So I found that fascinating.
Yeah. And Dad, you've had obviously criticism through your life, particularly your political career, about your upbringing. Is this an opportunity to give people a bit more of an understanding of what it was really like? I mean, that you didn't get taken around in sort of carriages around the Adelaide Hills and wear a sort of coat and tails. And
by the time I got into politics, I was pretty used to it. After all, I went to the Crafers Primary School in the Adelaide Hills, and my father was not only the local MP, but towards the end of my time at the school, he was a cabinet minister, and the other school children ribbed me about that and about the Downers being posh and so on. So by the time I got to become a member of Parliament when I was in my early 30s, I'd had plenty of experience. And I've always said this of it, actually, it's right. I am very privileged. But the greatest privilege that I have had is that my parents loved me and my sisters. And so we never had that sense of being unwanted or just being an irritation or a burden on the family. And I think that's much more important than whether my father inherited any money or made any money or didn't have any money. Those issues, I think, are fundamentally a bit peripheral. And the other thing I say to Labor critics who go on, and you still see this on Twitter, go on about my parents and my grandparents and so on. Look, next time I'll make sure I choose better, and I'll consult you and find out what sort of parents you think I should have, and I'll go with that.
Yeah.
If I could just make a point there, I think what the taunts and the insults, particularly as soon as you land in Parliament, which is what happened to Alexander, they help build resilience and perseverance and a thick skin. Politics is largely theatre. Well, many parts of it are theatre. And those comments made by Keating or Kim Beazley even or whoever, they might sound wounding, but it's pantomime in some ways. And I think the politicians understand that's how they play.
Tony, you're a long-term journalist as well as a political advisor, but there's a sort of a stylised Liberal politician versus Labor politician, and I wonder if you could reflect on that. What's the sort of ideal Liberal politician's biography or CV like versus the ideal Labor politician? And was there something in Alexander's background that didn't quite fit what the public was expecting?
Yeah, I suppose, I suppose ideally, your aspiring Liberal politician would be from a middle class, even lower working class background. They'd be regarded as self-starters and having built their own careers and lives.
Sort of a John Howard.
Yeah. That'd be, I suppose that's archetypal in a way.
Yeah.
But Labor Party, well, usually going to come from a union family, union background. Not always, though. I mean, look, there's lots of dynasties in the federal parliament in Canberra. The Downers are one of them. But there's also the Beasleys. There were the Barnards. Lance Barnard's Labor Deputy Prime Minister. His father was in
the Creans.
Yeah.
McClellans.
Yeah, there's many of them.
Yeah.
It's not unusual, I don't think, when someone's engaged in politics that their children might be watching and listening and learning through that process. So I'm not big on the argument that there's some problem with political dynasties. I mean, often people come into Parliament pretty well prepared from that background.
There's something, though, in the hard luck story that you've risen above, and I always find that, you know, a Labor politician will often sort of hark back to how hard it was that they got through a childhood through immense deprivation. You know, Anthony Albanese often talks about, you know, single mother household in housing commission flat, and, you know, amazing efforts on the part of his mother. We were able to bring him up through sort of almost poverty to, you know, end up at Sydney Uni, and away he went. So there's something in that sort of stylised Labor Party caricature, I think.
The Americans call it the log cabin story, don't they?
Yes, they love it, yes.
And so it's not, this is not unique, this phenomenon is not unique to Australia by any means.
Yeah.
But I doubt that it amounts to as much as commentators think, because with the public, what they're ultimately concerned about is the policies and the personality of the politician. They're much more important to them than whether they were brought up in a log cabin or, you know, in a mansion.
Because there's often a debate around these politicians. Are they really, you know, do they really get it? Are they representative of Australia as it is? You know, men, women, migrants, you know, European migrants, Asian migrants, and, you know, the whole kind of diverse mix. And you have to wonder, I think, sometimes how far do you go down that path of mirroring society in the representation in Parliament, because in the end of the day, the only experience you're ever going to have is the one you had. You can't possibly have, you know, everyone's experience represented in just, 150 seats in Parliament plus the 76 in the Senate. So
the worst possible thing for politicians is to try to reinvent their personal history. I mean, that's the worst thing.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, it's all just very superficial, whether the politician is male or female, whether they're, you know, Indigenous or whether they're Anglos or whatever they happen to be, whether they come from a rich family or a poor family. It's of marginal importance. What is important and what is, I think, lacking in politicians today particularly is what is their philosophical direction? What is the framework that they bring to the huge task of government? And what do they believe in? And too often now, I'm afraid they're exposed as trying to woo the public through superficial sloganeering, which is based on opinion polling. So they do the polls, they respond to the polls and tell the public what they think the public want to hear, rather than trying to implement policies that might be in the best interest of the country, and then persuade the public to support those policies. There's not much of that anymore.
Now, you grew up in a political family. Your father was elected in 1949 and you were born in 1951, so you don't know a life without a politician as a father. And your father's a part of the new Menzies Liberal Party, new Menzies government, the 49ers, and then is an immigration minister in the Menzies government. You met Robert Menzies many times, and the
sort of philosophy with us sometimes.
Yeah, it would have been amazing.
Smoked cigars inside the house in those days.
Shock horror.
I know.
Yeah,
usually
for the passive smoking.
Horrific.
Usually for the Adelaide test, wasn't it, when he arrived at your place?
I'm not sure about the Adelaide test, actually.
So I want to understand what sort of political philosophy you were being fed then in those early conversations with your father, but also being exposed to people like Robert Menzies who were so imbued in the political philosophy of Australian liberalism?
Well, I'd have to say in the conversations I had as a child and a teenager with Menzies, we didn't dwell much on political philosophy, but what did I think he was about? The first thing I would say of Robert Menzies is he was extremely kind to children and teenagers, and he would show such an interest in you, and he'd ask you, but he was very focused on education, as his career makes clear. So he'd ask you, what are your favourite subjects at school? This was always rather daunting because if I said history, he would then say, well, what history are you learning? And then he would hit you with a lot of questions about it, he having a huge knowledge of these subjects. So what did I think that he was about? His kindness was something that really struck me. So this notion that liberals are people who don't care and just care for the rich wasn't something that was apparent to me through both Menzies and my father. They seemed to be very focused, on the contrary, on lifting people's living standards. They were also, when people use the word aspirational now, they were very ambitious for the country. And it was their sense of ambition, and I often use this phrase, some journalists apparently don't like, which doesn't matter because I think the phrase is important. People like my father and Menzies talked a lot about nation building. They had this concept in their heads that Australia, modern Australia, obviously not referring here to Indigenous Australia, but modern Australia was a relatively new country, and it was an opportunity to build a hugely successful, prosperous and democratic society. And they had this massive ambition to build the country. So they wanted to see people's living standards increase. They wanted the population, by the way, to increase. They wanted Australia to increasingly have influence in the region, if not beyond. But I think to some extent beyond. So that's sort of gone now, hasn't it? I mean, you don't get a sense that our politicians have great ambitions for Australia, although I do get a sense they have great ambition, but ambition for themselves.
For themselves, yeah.
You mean business class flights to the UN, that sort of thing?
Well, I wouldn't want to get into the game of hypocrisy here. I have often been to the UN and I've been business class.
And probably first. Alexander, basically his first career, I think you had maybe a couple of other goes, but your first major career is in DFAT. How important is that foreign policy experience, do you think, for what is to come? You know, serving in Brussels and...
Well, there's a lovely story about
yeah.
Alexander's first year at DFAT, told by one of his old bosses, I think at the time, Bill Farmer. And Bill said that he wrote the report card for Alexander's first year. And he identified him as talent. He said he's got the capacity to be the best diplomat of his generation, as long as he learns to control a tendency to bumptiousness.
Did he give examples?
No, I think what he was basically saying was that he was a precocious talent with a lot of opinions. I think that was essentially it. But, so clearly he'd been identified as someone on the march, and when he went to Brussels in late 1970s, I think he came under the tutelage of Jim Plimsoll, who in the book Alexander describes as probably the greatest of Australia's diplomats.
Yes, yeah, one of the legends.
Yeah.
And then became governor of Tasmania. You meet John Howard for the first time when you were on posting in Brussels. Was it, auspicious or not, or did it leave a big impression on you? He was an up-and-coming figure of the day. He was a minister for trade, I think it was.
Special Minister for Trade
Negotiations.
Yeah. So a junior minister in the Fraser government.
A junior minister, but he came to lobby the European Commission to get a better deal for Australian agricultural products, which was a big issue at that time. Huge antipathy that the Fraser government had to the European Union, as we now call it. Anyway, I first met him at a reception. The ambassador was away. And so the head of the trade section in the embassy, a guy called Lloyd. He was known as Smoky Lloyd because he never stopped smoking cigarettes in the office. That dates it to the 1970s. He had a reception at his residence for John Howard, and various people from the European Commission and other EU institutions came along. And I went along there to that reception with Roger Pescott, who subsequently became a Victorian state MP. He was the first secretary and I was the third secretary. And John Howard was there, of course. The reception was for him. And he must have spent 15 minutes talking to me and Roger. He was absolutely charming. And
he knew you were fellow travellers, though, politically. He must have got the sense, given you were.
We were. But he would have known that anyway because he would have known about my family.
Yeah.
But he spent a good deal of time talking to us and, he was obviously a sharp, focused politician going somewhere. I didn't necessarily think this was a man who inevitably would become a prime minister. But I thought he was a very good politician.
John Howard was very evocative in his description of that same meeting. He said there was this young diplomat bouncing around excitedly and enthusiastic.
The bumptiousness.
He said a bit like a puppy-like quality.
Oh, I can well
Charming
imagine. Yes.
And attractive.
Yes. Sweet, endearing. Who doesn't love a puppy? What about the journey to politics? So from DFAT, from obviously Malcolm Fraser's office in the very early 80s and then into politics. How would you describe that, Tony, as a biographer?
But he did his diplomacy, but he went via Westbank as an economist. There was also a stint as the acting executive director designate of the Australian Chamber of Industry and Commerce.
Australian Chamber of Commerce was called then.
Yeah. So that's, for someone quite young, that's still decent breadth of experience. And I think, in particular, the experience in diplomacy had given Alexander all sorts of intellectual heft, which, if you were in the Labor Party, on the Labor Party benches looking across, you'd say, I might need to knock that guy over before he gathers momentum. So I suspect that's partly explains why the taunts and the insults.
Yeah.
It's someone with Alexander would have had an understanding of the fact that the tariff walls were coming down at the time and that business in Australia was needing to attract investment from what was becoming footloose global capital. So having a broader understanding of those sorts of issues would have been pretty handy to have in the kit bag.
You'd worked for Malcolm Fraser and just recently celebrated, I guess, from your point of view, the 50th anniversary of the election of the Fraser government.
Celebration.
We celebrated, some just commiserated. I don't know. A lot of hated.
Well, that's too bad.
But, Fraser's record on economics is not the strongest. He's lauded for many achievements, which deservedly so, but on economic reform, he was found wanting, particularly by his political colleagues, and really, eviscerated by Neil Brown after the 1983 election loss. What about your own economic ideas of that time, going into politics at the 84 election, the expansion of the parliament to taking the seat of Mayo, which had covered part of your father's old seat of Angus? Did you come with a clear idea that you were going to be an economic dry, or as a sort of Fraser acolyte, one of his staffers, was there still a bit of the old Keynesian Fraser economic agenda that was left over and had to be sort of squeezed out of you and dry you out?
Well, I think the debate about Malcolm Fraser and his approach to economics is probably been hijacked by his opponents, but I think his position was much more nuanced than that. He obviously was very much in favour of a private sector-driven economy, but, given his age and when he grew up, he had a distrust of big business. Well, I might have shared this a little bit with Menzies. A distrust of, you'd know better than I would, but I think a distrust of big business, of corporate behemoths. So he was more interested in the consumer. So in that sense, I agreed with him. I've never been a great lover of big business. I mean, I'm not against big business, but they will operate entirely in their own interests. I regard myself as somebody who's on the side of the consumer. And therefore, right from the get-go, right from the time I worked for Westpac, I was what nowadays would be called an economic rationalist. If you interfere with the market, well, good luck with that, but you're going to have to mop up the unintended consequences of your intervention. And sometimes interventions are necessary, of course. You have to have a social security system and you have to tax people for that and defence and to some extent healthcare. But you have to realise there are costs associated with that and you need to be transparent about the costs you're imposing. I was never in favour of tariffs. I was very supportive of the Hawke government reducing tariffs. I thought that was excellent economic policy. When the dollar was floated, that's when I was the executive director designate, was my title, of the Australian Chamber of Commerce. Okay. I supported that. I was much in favour of that. So I've never really changed my position. I've learned much more about economics as the years have gone by, of course, from learning about economics at university through to now. I've learned a great deal. But nothing has persuaded me that economic rationalism is wrong. So nowadays you hear it's much more fashionable to intervene in the market, protectionism. In Australia's case, tariff protectionism isn't popular, but on both sides of politics there are people who are in favour of, subsidising industries and introducing new industries. There's one MP wants to re-establish the car industry in Australia. Yes. Well, good luck with that. By the way, it stands as an example of what I think. Surely the consumers are the people who matter here, and they should have access to affordable, efficient, good quality cars. That's what matters.
Tony, if we can skip ahead a little bit, Dad becomes the youngest ever leader of the Federal Liberal Party, the age of just 42, which, I'm 46 now, so I think, God, 4 years younger than I am now.
By the way, it was all over by the time I got to your age.
Yes, it's a very much distant memory. But you were Foreign Minister by then, so all good. As a journalist...
Well, I was around at the time, yeah.
Yes, you were around at the time, and you no doubt had views and potentially reported on it. I mean, how did you see the Downer leadership of the Liberal Party, such as it was? It was a bit blink and you miss it.
Well,
it wasn't the shortest ever leadership.
No, I think it was shortest Liberal leadership.
Oh, okay.
I've noticed Susan Lee is getting very close to passing me now.
It's 256 days, I think, wasn't it?
256, okay.
No, I've never counted.
But it started off, it started off as a starburst of excitement and energy. I mean, the two-party preferred opinion polls were sensational for Alexander in the first few months. So it's the dream team. It was Peter Costello and Alexander.
Yeah.
So it was regarded as a this might work. This might allow the Liberal Party to knock over the Keating government. But the challenge of integrating and maintaining unity in the coalition then was as difficult as it's proved now.
Yeah.
Very hard to, unless you're in government, probably that helps a lot. If you're in opposition, it's very difficult to herd the cats, I think.
What about the gaffes though, Tony? I mean, with Menzies, we sort of describe him as a learning leader. So he has his first stint as leader and Prime Minister, of course, 39 to 41. But it's pretty, it's a difficult time. It's World War II. But he certainly does things during that leadership period that he doesn't do the second time round, the way he treats his colleagues, the backbench and the coalition.
Yeah. Well, I think Alexander has a sense of humour. But sometimes it means he tells jokes that can be regarded as off-colour by some people.
Yeah, and even in the early 90s. Imagine how off-colour they are now. Now there's
different jokes.
John Howard makes the point that Alexander could get himself into terrible trouble sometimes with some of the things he said. But the point I made earlier, he was doing sensationally well in all the approval ratings, but the fundamental structural problem was trying to unify a party, particularly when Keating was throwing things like the Republic, gay rights in Tasmania, post-Mabo, the issue of Indigenous land rights, all very difficult issues to resolve at that time within the coalition parties.
Now, you didn't beat Keating as leader, but you beat him as part of a Liberal team led by John Howard, and you were shadow foreign minister. I mean, what was it like? Well, what was it like beating Keating? It must have been pretty nice.
Well,
but he was a formidable political opponent.
I'm not sure about that. He was popular with the journalists, with the press gallery. And for his supporters, he was often very funny. But in a way, he was a kind of Donald Trump type figure. And I don't know how he would feel about that comparison, but that's the comparison I would make. He was hugely abusive towards people who he regarded as opponents. And does that really work for you? In America, that might. In Australia, I don't think it does. I think that worked against him with the public. Most journalists are left-leaning, not necessarily the institutions they work for, but they themselves are mainly left-leaning. So they thought all his abuse of the coalition was all terribly funny. I mean, calling them dogs going back to eat their own vomit and expressions like that. I tell you what, that may have caused journalists to laugh in the press gallery, but out there in voterland, I think people really are recoiled from that sort of language. So I've never been persuaded that Keating was the master that people on the left claim him to have been. And as for his agenda, I mean, he was focused on the Republic, which is, at best a peripheral issue. At worst, asking for constitutional upheaval, which, the country has other priorities than constitutional upheaval. You'd only go through a constitutional upheaval if you absolutely had to, otherwise you'd avoid it. Yeah, reconciliation, as he would have termed it, land rights, Mabo, all of that, he had to deal with that. Of course, that was delivered to him by the High Court. But the way he handled those issues was often very divisive. And then as for his claim that Australia was going to engage with Asia and the Liberals didn't, I thought one of Labor's great arguments against the Liberals was that the Liberals had been in favour of the Vietnam War. And it strikes me as passing strange to then turn around and say the Liberals aren't interested in Asia, because the last time I looked, Vietnam was in Asia. So, I just thought his agenda was a sort of combination of necessity from the Mabo case. There's no doubt about that. But beyond that, it was confected, really.
I think he's been an incredibly powerful figure in changing the narrative around Menzies era history and positioning Labor and the Whitlam legacy. So Hawke thinks Whitlam is a disaster, which he was. Keating frames it differently. He goes, before Whitlam, we had 23 years of sort of Menzies era and ignored Asia. We were forelock tugging.
The Rip Van Winkle years.
The Rip Van Winkle years. We were forelock tugging Anglophiles, obviously arch monarchists, stuck in the sort of Edwardian era. And that, yes, Australia sort of didn't wake up until Whitlam, and that was sort of the beginning of the modernising project. And it really has stuck. But journalists will repeat Keating's criticisms, and not just journalists, but academics and textbooks. There is a sort of belief that the 50s and 60s were a no man's land, and that it wasn't until the 70s that we really got going. And then we had sort of a, aberration of Fraser. And then finally, Hawke and Keating got Australia really on the right track, discovering Asia, reforming the economy and reckoning with Indigenous, land rights and the like. And he's wrong on a lot of fronts, and yet it's to this day pervasive.
That's how you would define yourself if you're claiming you ought to be the party of reform and you want to paint your opponents as conservative shellbacks. And Keating was very effective in the way he framed that. I'm never in the habit of defending him. But I would say the one time when I think that abrasive, bullying almost persona was highly effective was the 1992 election campaign where he monstered and mauled John Hewson over GST. It was like a...
1993.
1993, yeah. It was like a sort of a brawling drunk in a pub. It was just monstering him, but it was very effective.
It was very effective.
Yeah.
But I think you make a very strong point, both of you actually. I think Keating understood that you need to win the history wars. You need to win the history wars. And he really threw his back into that. And where the Liberal Party, in contrast, has been, other than John Howard, pathetic, really, is its capacity to fight the history wars. I mean, the Liberal Party should always be out there proclaiming the Menzies legacy, and that might help if they knew something about it, and a lot of them don't.
And the Fraser legacy.
And I was about to say, and as for Malcolm Fraser, I mean, when we got to the 50th anniversary of the dismissal on the 11th of November 2025, all the Labor people were out there saying what a shocking thing this was, and Albanese made a speech denouncing Fraser and Kerr and so on. But where were the Liberals? Where were the Liberals saying that they got rid of the most shocking government that Australia has ever had, and going on about the Kemlani affair and all of these things? The chaos of the Whitlam years was replaced by a much more orderly government. It wasn't without its problems, but a much more orderly government of Malcolm Fraser. Well, where are the Liberals out there proclaiming these things? I've often thought I should do some of this myself, but, you know, it's up to the current generation of politicians to fight for the legacy of the party, because that helps guide people into the future as to what the party might do in the future. Yeah. So that is where Keating was very effective, creating this false narrative about Menzies and the Liberals.
The 96 election, the 11th of March 1996, I remember that well. I was 16 and I remember being at the electorate office in Mayo in Stirling, and there being great excitement. We finally won. But Pauline Hanson's a big figure at that election, and you're foreign minister, new foreign minister, and you're going to, for the first time in 12 years, put forward a coalition, a liberal foreign policy, and make relations with your Asian counterparts. But you have the shadow of One Nation and what Pauline Hanson's talking about, the Asian invasion. I mean, how does that impact your first visits and forays into ASEAN politics and East Asia?
It didn't happen immediately, actually. Pauline Hanson had been a Liberal candidate, and then the Liberal Party had sacked her, but it was too late to get her off the ballot paper, so she won the seat. It's worth remembering that. Yeah. The Liberal Party, by the way, sacked her as a candidate because of something she'd said. I think it wasn't about immigration. It might have been about Indigenous people.
It wasn't really until they made the speech in September.
I was going to say, it wasn't until September when she talked about the need to cut back on Asian immigration or whatever. So... I'd been the foreign minister for about 6 months by the time that happened. It was a media storm, and the Labor Party and their fellow travellers were very effective at whipping it up. But in terms of my dealings with my counterparts in Asia, it was never a problem. They understood she was an independent MP, that the Liberal Party, the governing party, had sacked her for her comments, and we distance ourselves from her.
Did you disagree with Howard, though, on how to...
On tactics. Yeah. His tactic was best to ignore her, not to confront her, because if you confront her, you'll whip up more support for her. I thought it would suit us, and it would certainly suit me as the foreign minister, to denounce her. So I did on one occasion, and if not the only, one of very few occasions where John Howard and I disagreed with each other. I made a speech in which I denounced, the speech was about a whole lot of things, but in that speech I denounced Pauline Hanson And it was on TV that night, and John Howard rang me to reprimand me for, I think he perhaps thought I had broken ranks a little bit, which might be true, I suppose. That's not my normal modus operandi, but yeah.
Tony, you were a journalist still at the time?
I was, yeah.
International affairs
I came back from London
to
where I was European correspondent, to cover the Howard government first. So I think I got back on the day before the Port Arthur massacre. Oh. So the government ran into very, very significant difficulties straight away through no control of their own. Obviously, it was a massacre. And then the 8 days after you were sworn in, I think the Americans, Bill Clinton, sent 2 battle groups into the Taiwan Strait because China had been firing missiles at Taiwan in the midst of their presidential campaign, their first democratic presidential election campaign. I think Alexander put out a statement in support of the Americans, probably the only one in Asia to do that. And from the start, they went after him.
Yeah.
It was pretty significant.
What about East Timor? That was early in your term as Foreign Minister. Was that something you were expecting to focus on? It had obviously been an issue through the Whitlam, Fraser era, or Keating, but did you think you would end up seeing an independent Timor-Leste, as they call it now?
I thought it was an issue that needed to be resolved. That was my view. And DFAT was very comfortable with the then status quo. And I made the point to them that every so often there's going to be some confrontation in East Timor, military event. Confrontation might be exaggerating, where people are wounded or killed or whatever happens, and there will be a huge uproar in Australia. And in the end, it would make the whole issue of our relationship with Indonesia more difficult to manage. So I thought we should see whether there's a way through this, that if Indonesia wants to keep East Timor as what was its 27th province, then they have to find a way of legitimising that with the East Timorese people. So I came to this idea that we should do a survey of the East Timorese as best we possibly could, including those living in the diaspora, to see whether they would accept the Indonesian proposal to give them whatever it was called, wide-ranging autonomy, a special degree of autonomy. And I told the Indonesian Foreign Minister, Ali Alatas, I was going to do this. He was none too pleased about that, I'd have to say. But we did the survey, and the survey revealed that there was almost no support at all amongst the East Timorese for this. So then we came up with the idea that we should write to the Indonesian president, who turned out to be Habibie at that time, write to President Habibie in John Howard's name, suggesting that they go ahead with the wide-ranging autonomy, but then after a certain number of years, say, for example, 10 years, they should have some sort of consultation with the East Timorese public to see whether they would accept a continuation of that arrangement or whether they wanted independence. So that's how I thought we would find a way through here, and we did, but in a slightly different way, because Habibie's reaction to the letter was to say, OK, well, we're not going to give it 10 years. We're going to put it to consultation straight away. And I use the word consultation here rather than a referendum advisedly, because to start with, the Indonesians didn't want a referendum. They just wanted to have some consultative mechanism set up, which presumably they could control. But in any case, we told them that it should be a referendum supervised by the United Nations. And they ultimately obviously agreed to that, and everyone knows the rest of the history. So I would regard it as a huge foreign policy success for Australia, because whatever you think of East Timor, It has ultimately stabilised our relationship with Indonesia to the extent that we were able to sign a security treaty with them in 2006 known as the Lombok Treaty, and that's been repeated by subsequent Australian governments, and most recently by the Albanese government, just reinforced that Lombok Treaty. And our relationship has been pretty smooth since then.
Tony, the Pacific solution that ends up being the way that asylum seekers to Australia coming on boats are then processed offshore in Nauru and Manus Island, it's still to this day hugely controversial. I mean, you've worked as a journalist but also inside government. How have you felt about that as part of a government that was implementing a very controversial but effective policy, but then your journalist colleagues, in the end have been pretty critical, and not all, but a lot are very, very critical.
I think overwhelmingly that was probably the position of most people at that time. I think the opinions are shifting, though. Opinions are shifting certainly in Europe, where at the time of Tampa there would have been outrage in Europe that a country like Australia would be seen to be doing this. But now...
And they expressed their outrage to me, the Europeans.
But now, given the situation, they're facing a very similar crisis. It looks pretty much like a template for how some of the European governments will respond. Denmark turns back boats. It's quite a significant shift globally, really, within the Western democracies. I mean, Trump has very strong views on this too. So I think it was, at the time, it was regarded as pretty confronting. But over the journey, the notion that a democratic society is going to put up with unauthorised migrants arriving in vast numbers over an extended period of time, and that's not going to create a big political issue in the electorate is silly. It's obviously going to generate concern about what is happening with their immigration program. Can we trust our immigration program? The reason Australia's been successful in its immigration program is it's been orderly and controlled. I'm talking about in certainly the post-war era. And, that's part of the compact. You can't support publicly for a very generous immigration program if people think it's being watered or abused. So I think in over the long haul, people's views on that might have changed a bit.
How did you come up with it, the Pacific solution?
Well, John Howard said to me as the foreign minister, we had all these people on board the Tampa. The SAS had taken control of the Tampa. But what were we going to do with all these people? And said to me, you better find somewhere we can send them. So I rang around the region, and most of the responses were pretty blunt. No, the Indonesians wouldn't take them. We tried Singapore, Malaysia. It would be a test of memory to remember who I rang, but I rang a fair few people. And John Howard getting more and more anxious. I mean, this is by the hour business. This isn't by the week. The Fijians said that they would have a look at it and give it very careful consideration. But two things happened. One was the New Zealand Prime Minister, Helen Clark, went on Australian radio and condemned the Howard government for what they had done to intercept the Tampa and not let these people arrive in Australia. So when I got into the office that morning, I called in the New Zealand High Commissioner. And I said to him, given that your Prime Minister is condemning us, I would like to propose that you, New Zealand, accept some of these people. And he smiled at me and said, you've hoisted us on our own petard here. And they did they took over 100 of them, I think. They took 120 or so. And then when it came to Nauru, it was just that we had been, I had personally been speaking to the president of Nauru a couple of weeks before. Nauru wanted some assistance with purchasing fuel for their one diesel-powered power station. And they had run out of money and they couldn't afford the fuel for the power station. So I had lent them the money through AusAid, or maybe we gave them the money, whichever way around it was. And he was very grateful. So I rang him up and I said, Mr. President, a couple of weeks ago I bailed you out of a difficult problem, you wouldn't have any power in Nauru if it wasn't for me bailing you out. I was wondering if you could bail me out. I've got a bit of a problem here and I've got these people. And his response was, yes, Alex, happy to help. Oh. Just like that. And so subsequently we got into the election campaign, actually. And but let's see if my memory is right here. I think Peter Reith wasn't standing again. And we sent Peter Reith up there to negotiate the details. But that's how it happened. Nauru, yes, one of my staff, when we were sitting around, DFAT ran out of ideas very quickly as to what we could do. And one of my staff, who was a liaison officer from AusAid, actually, at the time, I don't think I'll mention her name, but she's a wonderful woman to this very day. She said, well, how about ringing the president of Nauru? You did him a favour the other day, and it worked a treat.
Incredible. The United States, the alliance with the United States, signed by the Menzies government almost 75 years ago. It'll be the 75th anniversary in 2026. The first time that the ANZUS Treaty was invoked was, of course, after September 11, and John Howard was in...
The 50th anniversary.
The 50th anniversary, yes. Well, it's rather inauspicious. What could the 75th bring? But we won't guess here. Can you talk about the relationship with the United States through your time as Foreign Minister? The Howard government, I think their relationship with the United States, I would say, I mean, Tony as an advisor but also as a journalist, you'd have a view. I mean, it was probably at its strongest during that Howard government era.
Well, when George W. Bush was the president, I think that was probably the high watermark in the bilateral relationship since 1901. We had a great relationship with George W. Bush, with him personally, John Howard and I. I mean, John Howard became firm friends with George Bush. I got on very well with Colin Powell and Condi. Donald Rumsfeld was a great, very amusing character, very good company, Donald Rumsfeld, who was a great guy. So we all got on very well with each other. And I mean, I think we basically saw the world very much in the same way, which wasn't quite the case with the Clinton administration. And, you know, if you go back in time, Fraser and Reagan, Fraser and Carter, Menzies and his counterpart, Eisenhower, Kennedy, they would have seen the world in slightly different ways. All of those prime ministers and presidents that I've just nominated then. You know, Nixon, Whitlam certainly didn't see eye to eye. So this was a coincidence of a close friendship, really, which made the ANZUS alliance all the more effective. We took a view, which is not necessarily a very popular view, that if you're in an alliance with another country, that country will come to your help if you run into difficulties. And if they run into difficulty and they need your help, you go to help them. So we did that after 9/11. That's why we invoked the ANZUS alliance. And it's why we went to Afghanistan. And we made a small contribution, but we made a contribution to the American invasion of Iraq. I mean, you can't, on the one hand, ask them to help you out, and on the other hand, when they need some help, say, oh, that might be a bit unpopular. So we took that balanced view of the alliance. It's not because we went into Iraq, but we notched up a huge achievement with the Americans, which was the free trade agreement, which led to a boom in the trade between Australia and the United States and an upsurge in bilateral investment as well. That was quite difficult to negotiate, but the president was all in favour of it. We were free traders, so we were no problem.
Back in those days, the US was too. Tony, on the US alliance, I mean, there's been a lot of criticism about the Iraq war, especially as the intelligence was found wanting. What do you think the big mistakes were of the Howard government and the Downer foreign ministry during that period?
Well, they were taking the same intelligence advice that London and Washington and the other allies were receiving. It wasn't coming just from the US, or it was coming from Germany, coming from France.
Israel,
yeah. So there was a widespread consensus that this guy was still a big problem in terms of WMD. So the attempt to get the UN Security Council to pass one final resolution to authorise the invasion was probably a critical part of the dynamic. That didn't happen. Chirac basically said he would veto, and once he did say that, then there was no way the Russians or the Chinese were going to support it either. So they were left with a choice to make. Do we push on anyway, and just get this guy out of the play totally, or do we have to accede to what the UN Security Council says? Well, the decision was made to go ahead anyway. That made it inevitably contentious, inevitably controversial. So that was sort of the context in which those decisions were made. So mistakes, well, everyone in the Western intelligence networks had made those same mistakes. They were all basically accepting of the same advice. No one knows quite what happened as to why the WMD didn't turn up, where it had been. Had it been destroyed? Had it been moved elsewhere? Or was Saddam just, in a way, foxing himself by pretending to the world that he still had WMD, thereby solidifying his support in the region and maintaining control over his own people, while leading the rest of the world to think that he was still in possession of these things. I mean, it has to be remembered he did use chemical weapons against the Kurdish minority in Halabja, the village.
Just at a bigger picture level, regime change was obviously used as a policy in Iraq, Afghanistan. There are regimes we would want to change these days. I mean, Putin, Xi Jinping is presenting humongous problems for the region and the world. Some may even say the US should have regime change. But I mean, regimes change as a sort of foreign policy approach is inherently risky, and in Iraq and Afghanistan, it did not end up delivering for the people. I mean, we've got the Taliban back now. You can argue why that is the case, and the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan obviously led to a very swift return of the Taliban, but maybe it was always inevitable. In Iraq, there are still people criticising the ongoing effects of the Iraq war. So, what is your view today in 2025 of regime change as a tool of foreign and defence policy?
So what you now call regime change has
neoconservatism
has a genesis. Well, people who are opposed to liberal democracy were definitely opposed to the spread of liberal democracy. But people like me who believe in liberal democracy and individual rights and the dignity of individual people will always be on the side of liberal democracy, people like me. And so for a long time after the end of the Cold War, we thought, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and when the Berlin Wall fell, which way did people go? Did they go east or did they go west? And if they went west, why did they go west? And so all of those East European countries were liberated and became democracies. And I think all of us thought the world would be a safer and a better place if democracy spread. And so when democracy had a chance of emerging, we thought we should support it. So that's what happened in Yugoslavia in 1999 with the so-called Kosovo War. And those countries, there was trouble, right? But those countries were eventually all democratized. And when it came to the Middle East, well, there's only one democracy there, and that's Israel. And we definitely would have thought the more democracy there was in the Middle East, the better the Middle East and the world would be for that. And then that became a pejorative idea, or the pejorative term, regime change. I mean, I used to say, well, what would you prefer? Would you prefer the Iranian regime run by a few ayatollahs and mullahs without any real agency for ordinary members of the public? Or would you rather Iran was a liberal democracy? I mean, what's your preference? And if the people of Iran started to rise up against the theocracy, the dictatorship that they suffer under, I'd be in favour of finding ways of supporting them. And just put this in context, that did happen at the time when President Obama came into office, and he decided he wouldn't support those people, but that instead he would enter into their ill-fated nuclear negotiations with the Iranians.
But there was the Arab Spring during that period.
Yeah, the Arab Spring.
Obama got a Nobel Peace Prize for what he was yet to do.
Yeah, the Arab
I don't think he got a Nobel Peace Prize for the red line in Syria. I don't think that happened.
It is.
No, he got the Nobel Peace Prize before he'd done anything.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's the time to get the Peace Prize.
Yeah. We are definitely at time. Oh. This has been a wonderful discussion. I think it's a fantastic book. Well done, Tony.
Thank you.
And, particularly on behalf of our family, it's nice to finally have something we can hold and read, given Dad didn't want to do it himself. We haven't covered a lot of topics, China, Russia, to name but a few, the Bali bombings.
My children.
Your children, your greatest work. But it's a significant period in Australia's history, our very recent history, but it's well worth remembering. We absolutely owe a debt to the Howard government and to your foreign policy leadership.
With the 30th anniversary of the election, the first Howard government comes up on March 2.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty good time. It's as good a time as any to look back on what that government achieved in the foreign policy sphere.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Tony and Alexander.
Pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.